hydroxychloroquine Rogan. Joe 11 hydroxymetabolite Rogan. Joe Mr. Athletic Greens with some modafinil and a couple of vapes Rogan. I firstly have to say and preface this video that I absolutely love Joe Rogan. He's given me so many free hours of thought-provoking and immersive entertainment over the past 10 years that it would be a disservice to say otherwise. In fact, I think I've watched more Joe Rogan than any other entertainer in the past 10 years. His depth of knowledge on certain topics ranging from astrophysics to blood sports honestly is at times astounding. And that's what drew me into his orbit, was his infectious thirst for knowledge. It was initially shocking to see at times deep into a podcast Joe's clarity about complex topics, which would rise up and shine, showcasing his stamina, general knowledge, and genuine intrigue, coupled with his natural ability to question and converse toe-to-toe with an intellectual. I must admit though, I have never, ever once laughed out loud to anything that Joe has ever said in all of the thousands of hours that I've listened to him. And this isn't to say that he hasn't said funny things. And again, it comes down to personal taste. It's just that his style of comedy is not for me. I'm not a fan of his stand-up comedy, but I'm a big fan of Joe. This led me to see his live stand-up act when he toured through Melbourne, Australia with Tony Hinchcliffe as his opening act. I fell in love with Tony that night. His comedy was actually laugh-out-loud funny, and his wit, stage presence, and delivery was head and shoulders above Joe's. I did enjoy the show that Joe put on, which was the second of the evening, but throughout the show I felt like I was caught up in the hypnosis that Joe is very good at casting over an audience. Almost like the way a sports psychologist works, Joe has the ability to work a crowd by hypnotic pressure laughter. I did laugh at his set, which at times was very interesting, with thought-provoking topics and unique takes on certain subjects. The act was peppered with funny premises, but I couldn't help but feel that someone like Dave Chappelle or Bill Burr could really put a unique flow into the sets. Joe's live comedy is very high energy and intense, and he delivers everything with that unique and certain vocal pitch, which he has developed, that is very engaging and has been refined from decades of UFC commentating and stand-up open mics. Joe is extremely good at the pressure and release principle and how and where and when to use it, which is what comedy essentially boils down to. A comedian will say something that is unexpected, witty and humorous, and the audience feels group pressure to join in the laughter. One particular bit I think illustrates this principle at work best for Joe is the Bruce Jenner routine that Joe would always close with, where in the climax, Joe would climb up on the stool, showcasing his physicality, and coupled with his mastery of microphone pitch, breathe heavily into the mic, impersonating Bruce's inner thoughts. This act puts great pressure on the audience. Some people do find it extremely funny, the way that he climbs up on the stool and the sounds that he makes, but personally, for my own taste, it's just not that funny. And I didn't laugh out loud because it was funny. I laughed out loud to join in with the group. It feels good to laugh in a group, and it's easy to go along with something when the group is doing it. And essentially, that's what we all want to do. We just want to laugh. To quote the great Harris Whittles, motherfuckers just want to laugh. I'm not aiming to detract from Joe one bit. That's not what this channel is about. All I want to do is highlight how different comedians entertain and showcase their strengths and differences to each other in this fascinating young art form, which is a medium that is built on general knowledge. Unlike others, such as music, whereby a 6-year-old can compose a masterpiece symphony, a comedian must work just like a novelist or any other writer to hone their voice and skills through many, many years of hard work, and must have a deep desire for general knowledge and understanding of the human condition and psychology. Joe is from the Boston School of Comedy. Not Boston born, but he spent his formative years in Boston schools, which tends to meld a certain type of comedian that is extremely witty and defensive, with a unique voice on society, history, and humanity. I really don't know the exact reason why Boston culture produces so many great comedians. Perhaps it's something that can be delved into at another time, but possibly it's due to the foundations of the city being laid by destitute Irish, fleeing the potato famine and political quagmire of mid-19th century Western Europe, bringing with them along the way their unique humour that was used to disarm difficult situations and unique speech patterns brought about by thousands of years of obsession with literature and the spoken word. Joe himself is a quarter Irish, which puts him in the same ilk as other Boston comedians like Bill Burr, who is half Irish, half German, and Patrice O'Neill, who is 100% Irish, and Greg Fitzsimmons, who is mythologically Irish. Joe made it to Hollywood in '92 and quickly established a name for himself at the Comedy Store under the tutelage of the great Mitzi Shore, who acted as an encouraging mother figure, developing and pushing Joe's comedy, because I believe Mitzi saw in Joe some gift that is special and unique, because he was not the drug-addled funny guy, he was the fit and determined, confident and witty guy from Boston. Much of Joe's success was no doubt in part due to his sports and fitness regime that he has been devoted to his whole life. And Joe is very in touch with the fundamental fact that with repetition comes results. Joe has applied that very simple principle to everything he does in life, most obviously his body and comedy. Going from that funny locker room guy that after a fight was cracking jokes with friends, developing into taking interest in comparing himself to other funny people and seeking them out for validation. Then coming to the realization that he could be a stand-up comedian himself with that repetitive practice of getting up on stage, talking and developing his craft. Joe is very much a craftsman comedian, which is not something to be ashamed of, but you know that everything he says on stage has been painfully whittled away at, like trying to turn an elk's femur bone into a Peruvian pan flute. Everything changed for Joe one day when the great and unique Eddie Bravo turned him onto marijuana, in much the same way and capacity that Bob Dylan turned the Beatles onto marijuana. The ripple effect of this event of one toke of a joint cannot be underestimated and changed the course of comedy and world entertainment forever. Joe remarked to Eddie how good the ice cream tasted that they were eating, and this quickly developed into realizing how good the music was that they were listening to, and how good this workout was, and how good are these movies, and hanging out at the Comedy Store, shooting the shit with friends. All of this enhancement came about from marijuana and fueled Joe's incredible depth of knowledge, as he would never want to be seen as a dumb stoner or somebody who has taken one too many head kicks. And it's just not that smart anymore. I really feel that marijuana unlocked a part of Joe that he could never have accessed through any other means, making him a kinder, more interesting and considerate person. To quote the great Joey Diaz, before Joe Rogan started smoking weed, he was a gorilla, even going so far as to once run out into the car park at the Comedy Store and chastise Joey and another comedian for smoking some weed and what he says was not acting professionally. Joe entered a new purple patch in his life when the next logical steps led him to bring recording equipment with him to the green rooms after shows and using that enthusiasm and momentum that was developed on stage to continue talking to other comedians in a long-form format. This brought about a lot of tut-tutting from other people not understanding what he's doing, but the principles of repetition paid off and traction was made with guests in this emerging and influential format, and as always the timing was right for Joe, who was very much ahead of his time, and the world was ready for much needed long-form dialogue discussions. Essentially, the podcast is just a continuation from the Art Bell podcast, which had recently wrapped up after his death. Joe is essentially Art Bell Part 2, but with Google, and he's much more honest, more enlightened, thought-provoking, insightful, level-headed, and, most importantly, much less fringe. Here are some of what I think are Joe's strengths and weaknesses. He is the best color commentator in all of sports commentary currently working in the world. And interestingly, he is one of the only color commentators who has never actually competed in the sport that he is commentating on. Although he does have a background in martial arts, Joe has never competed in the UFC. He's just extremely knowledgeable and very engaging. Joe's enthusiasm for whatever subject or topic he is interested in is infectious, and the way that he speaks about the fights or astrophysics or conspiracy theories is unlike anyone else. One of Joe's weaknesses is his taste in movies. Whatever you do, do not take movie recommendations from Joe Rogan. And I'm not the first person who has pointed this out. In fact, Joey Diaz made this comment years ago in his podcast that Joe Rogan has the worst taste in movies ever. But it's quite understandable, because Joe spent all of his formative and youthful years in gyms training and not sitting high in a movie theater or on the couch watching and smoking and talking about movies. You could see that in the Quentin Tarantino episode of the Joe Rogan Experience. He was so out of his element that Quentin was rattling sabers around movie knowledge, and Joe had no idea how to approach it. Joe's confidence on stage is immaculate. He has never once, to my mind, ever showed any form of shyness or lack of confidence in himself. There was, however, a weird little stage during the podcast where Joe would get a little awkward and shy when saying goodbye to guests and the audience at the end of an episode. But I think this was just due to him being high and overthinking things, taking them far too preciously. I think there is a part of Joe that relishes in the fact that he is very physically dominant and that any threat to him on stage is inconsequential, whether that's from something internal or external. This has come about through many decades of focus on physical fitness, which is scientifically proven to equate to a boost in self-esteem and inner confidence. Joe's general knowledge is outstanding. He has a thirst and deep desire for knowledge and the truth, and his ability to recall facts and timelines is uncanny, although not always 100% correct, as he is a stoner after all. That's why the great young Jamie is there, acting as backup to make those corrections and fact check, which all feeds into the success of the podcast, which is something unique to be able to have real-time fact-checking in long-form dialogue conversations. And as always, Joe's timing was perfect for this success. Joe is also extremely good at laughing at himself, which is a very important skill, not just as a comedian, but in life. Joe doesn't take himself too seriously and isn't offended when other people joke at his expense. I'm sure at some stage Joe did take things a little too seriously, but over many years Joe has learned to fight those natural instincts, which is endearing, and feeds into his next big skill and strength, which is his people skills. Joe's confidence allows him to utilize fully his supreme set of people skills, allowing him to speak in conversation with anybody about any topic in any circumstance or situation, with a level-headedness and openness that is conducive to great dialogue and warm meetings. Joe has two great vocal impressions that he does, the first being Alex Jones and the second being Joey Diaz. His impressions of these two are unmatched in my opinion, and I think the best in the business. Again, he has that certain vocal pitch which lends itself to impersonating these two characters and is so effective. Joe is also surprisingly good when imitating a song. He can sing, but he doesn't allow himself to fully. But he has very good pitch recognition. I think this comes down to Joe's accent being American, and as we know, all Americans all speak in one key. I think some of the best humor from Joe is when he's outside at the Comedy Store, just joking around, being very casual and witty. This is the funniest I've ever seen Joe, and is a true display of Joe's wit, impersonation, and endearing humor.
Do you remember the pilot who took the plane from Cuba? Come on.
Nobody does, bro. Nobody knows Cuban-American history. Nobody. Just you.
No, he's not.
Joey always has a crazy story. Remember when the Cubans, they took over the Bronx? The whole fucking week, I'm going to tell you something, Joe Rogan. The fucking power went out, and they were like, fuck it, we never have power. We're used to this, cocksuckers. We're going to own this fucking city. And I'd be like, what year is this? 63, Joe Rogan.
Hey, let the guy on.
Well, I was born in 67.
The guy took the plane.
Nobody remembers that.
The guy went to Cuba and took the plane.
Joe Rogan, he took the plane.
He took the plane for the
fucking
States.
bananas, spun the propellers, started himself. That's how bad this
He got a
motherfucker
Cuban
was.
sandwich to go.
No pilot training whatsoever. Fuck it, I seen Bugs Bunny.
Fuck it. The hell with it. We're out of here.
What a way to whip the pony's dead.
Can't take a joke, take a shuttle. Mad Flavor's here.
Joe's work ethic shines through in everything that he does, from comedy to personal fitness and his podcast. This is something that Joe is very conscious of, and he knows that it's something he must keep working on and continuously giving attention to, because once the work ethic starts to slip, then the whole ride is over. Joe also has great wit that allows for stimulating and engaging conversations from every shade of comedy to argumentative dialogue. His wit with opinions and decisions and remarks is extremely good, and his comedic wit is way above average. But as mentioned previously, for my tastes, I don't find anything that he says laugh out loud funny. Although Joe Rogan is a unique individual, overall I would say that he has a very generic style of comedy that is very craftsmanlike. His whole comedy stems from being that funny guy in the locker room who's worked hard, but it's the best style of generic comedy out there in my opinion. However, in comparison to somebody like Bill Burr or Dave Chappelle, Joe can't hold a candle to their canter and skills of flow on stage. It's just that Joe has done so much repetition on his act that he gets the laughs, which keeps propelling him to the next steps. One thing Joe is guilty of is speaking far too much and too often about the craft of creating comedy. Not to say that he's giving away the secrets of how to be funny, because in all honesty, I don't believe that can be taught and is something innate. Joe is very nurturing to other comedians and encouraging of upcoming talent, and he doesn't covet the craft. But Joe is guilty of romanticizing the struggling early days of the comedy persona far too much and putting it into the realm of folklore and preciousness. I personally don't like it when comedians talk about getting up and doing sets, writing, working on bits and crafting comedy. I want to think that it's all in the moment inspiration, and the best comedians make it feel like that. If not, to me it comes off as contrite and cheap. I don't want to know about the art form. I just want to laugh. I just want to think that all comedy is spur of the moment. It's inspiration, in spirit, right in the moment, live in the now. I think that's where the greatest comedy comes from, and is what I respond to the most, especially when it comes out in the arena of casual conversation. And that's why I love Joe's podcast so much, because it facilitates that of its guests. Overall, I would rate Joe a 7 for wit. He is not a laugh out loud comedian to me, but he is very sharp mentally and very quick to spout facts that are both acerbic and informative. I rate Joe's comedy writing a 6. I think of Joe more as an entertainer with good craftsmanship and concepts, with a deep desire for the truth. But his comedic persona and stage act I don't enjoy, and is not my taste in comedy. Joe's voice is a 10. He has that very certain pitch that is uniquely his own, and it's one of his many strengths that has carried him throughout his whole career, and that he's utilized to great effect and success. And finally, I would rate Joe's comedy style a 5, as it's very generic and not something that I think is particularly unique and is not laugh out loud funny. in comparison to the other huge comedians that are of Joe's ilk. Many thanks for watching, guys. I really hope that you found it informative, and there's going to be many comedy videos to come. Please subscribe and share, and you can also help the channel by subscribing to my 3-minute comedy newsletter. Details in the description box below.